You are listening to the Place We Find Ourselves podcast. I'm Adam Young, and today we are continuing to look at the importance of engaging our bodies when it comes to the healing of trauma. I am joined today by Heather Stringer, a therapist who takes the body seriously. She is also very skilled in designing rituals that facilitate healing. Today we talk about both our physical bodies and the importance of rituals. Thanks so much for listening. All right, I'm here with Heather Stringer. Heather, it's good to see you.
It's good to be with you as well.
Say a bit about what you spend your time doing, where you are located geographically. Just give a bit of an introduction about you.
Yeah, I am currently in Seattle, Washington. And right now in my life, I am a janitor, a teacher, a math tutor, a mother, a wife, a therapist. I am so many roles right now. In usual time, I am a ritual maker and an artist and a licensed mental health therapist.
And we're going to talk some about ritual later, but when you say ritual maker, just what does that mean?
I have found that so often we feel like a shift is needing to be made in our lives. And we just, I think in Western culture and American culture and traditions just have been a little bit anemic. Rituals is this very, I think, poignant way of letting yourself undergo the change that's trying to happen. And so it's creating a space that is set apart or is a sacred or holy space. And you get to engage kind of the story that is shaping the present moment with actions, with your senses. And it allows you, I think, to like fully undergo like what it is that's happening in your life and to honor it really well.
Yes.
Then you have not only a signpost in your timeline, but you have this very rich experience of, okay, this happened to me and this matters. And I know that I'm capable of continuing into that change that is happening in my life.
Rituals are ways of engaging our story.
Mm-hmm.
Say a bit about your journey with story. When did you learn that you had a story? What's that journey looked like for you personally?
Probably up until I was 24, I thought I had a pretty boring story, actually. Like it was kind of like a good, parents love me, nothing too intense, not these very explicit traumatic experiences. So, but on the other hand, I had a lot of self-contempt throughout my life and at times suicide ideation and depression. So there was this dissonance for me where it's like, oh, I have a good story. I have it was a normal life. And yet my body and my heart and soul bore so much of the brunt. And so it didn't quite make sense to me until I went, my dad studied under Dan Allender. And so we had his books. And from a pretty, I don't know, probably in my adolescence, I told myself, I am not going to get close to Dan Allender's work with a 10-foot pole. I'm going to stay at a distance because it associated with my dad. But then when I was, I think, 22, my parents somehow hoodwinked my siblings and I into going to a conference that Dan was teaching at. And so I remember listening to how he was talking about the Gospels and that God is one who is bringing us to a banquet where we're eating some of the most, scrumptious food and tasting really good wine. And so it just resonated so deeply. And in that moment, I felt very intrigued. I'm like, okay, this Dan Allender is not the one that maybe I thought he was. And then that led me to grad school at the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology. And there I began to step into more of, I actually have a story that has a lot of pain. And though it's subtle, there's something really poignant there that I need to explore, and pain that I have maybe twisted it into comedy. And so I think I realized that subtle stories are at times more insidious and harder to uncover. It's more like carbon monoxide in the home where you can't really smell it. You don't know it's there, but your body begins to be affected by it over time. And so that has been my journey from age 24 to now, is just really stepping into honoring, I think, the pain that has been there, but I didn't quite know how to descend into it.
And so one of the clues for you that you had a story that had some harm in it was your self-contempt.
Yeah.
How was that a clue?
I could never resolve it. So there was something, it was always a dead end. Anytime that I would try and resolve the self-contempt, it just would lead to more self-contempt because the requirement was I had to figure it out. I had to find enough brain power. I had to be, I had to become smarter. I had to become, more charismatic. It led me to, again, just more retreating and more depression. But still, there was something in me that was trying to emerge.
Self-contempt, especially if you don't think you have a story, but you're aware of self-contempt, like that's a great kind of light on the dashboard of your car that's saying, hey, maybe there's something there, even if you're not aware of it. And maybe it's subtle, because for you, the subtlety of the harm hid the harm from you until grad school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. It's a great signal. If you find yourself in this cycle of moving around yourself with hatred, then definitely there's something that's trying to work out.
So as you start engaging your story in grad school, realizing you have a story, realizing some of the subtleties of your story, some of the harm in your story, what are some of the obstacles that got in the way of you going deeper?
My family had a very dominant way of thinking through things. And because there was such a one way of thinking through things or feeling through things, difference was so threatened. And I was just so different from the outset. I was an artist and I went to art school. I did these things that were different, but it was always such a dilemma for me because my difference almost required me to retreat and to leave. And yet in my leaving, I felt so much guilt because I wasn't joining the family. Like I was on the outside and somehow that meant that I was wrong. Like there was something that I was doing that was wrong. So I was constantly in this dilemma. So I think for me, the obstacle was being able to take back my mind, being able to take back my body, being able to take back my heart and soul, and to say that difference is not something that is actually like inherently bad, but it actually is a signal. It's another signal that there's something there to press into.
Last year, you wrote a piece for the Allender Center blog that talked about our bodies, our physical bodies. And I want to kind of transition and start talking some about bodies. Here's an excerpt from it. You say, our bodies are phenomenal and vast, yet how often are we fighting against them? It's such a common experience to be in conflict with our bodies. The physical pain, the appearance, or the cravings of our body uncover the struggle to be in communion with them. And I love those sentences. So let's just unpack them a bit. First of all, fighting against our bodies. What do you mean by that? And how do we do it?
I mean, I think it's actually sometimes easier to fight against our bodies than to move towards them. Because I think when we move towards them, we open ourselves up to desire, we open ourselves up to beauty, and that then elicits attention. I mean, it brings people closer to us. And then that, I think, creates a lot of noise as well as memories of when people have moved close to us, it's resulted in harm or it's resulted in being taken advantage of. So I would say that fighting against or fighting with our bodies is maybe even more comfortable at times. And what I mean by that is we get preoccupied with our cravings, where we find ourselves like craving something, whether it's a food or an experience. And we maybe know on some level that it's not actually beneficial for us. And so we get caught in this like tussle where we become more fixed on resisting it, but then indulging it, and then finding ourselves in shame. And then the cycle begins over and over again. And so I think instead of us moving in and with our bodies to say, what is this actually saying? Like, what are the words? What are the stories? What are the sensations that I need to explore and understand a little bit more? Yeah. I mean, I think I had one client of mine who her ears would hurt often, and she'd get so upset with it. And over time, we were able to sit with, what are your ears saying? Instead of being against them, instead of saying like, try and finding ways to fix it, what do your ears need to tell us? And what came out eventually over a long period of time was that her mom would tell her nasty secrets about her dad in her ears as a young girl. And really highly inappropriate things that she'd whisper into her ears. And so there was something about what her ears were trying to communicate to her and to me that needed that attention. And so instead of being against her ears, it's to say, what is it that you're needing your heart to know and to hear? And I think there's a lot of language there. There's a lot of story to be told.
Yes. It's such a stunning story because implicit in the story is that our bodies hold some truths about our life, about our story, and they're almost daring us to take them seriously, these body parts. In this case, her ears. And what you're inviting us to do is to listen to our bodies.
Yeah.
And to listen to the clues that they may be giving us about what has been true of our lives. Because you didn't know what was going on with her ears, but you paid attention and it mattered to you.
Yeah. And I think that's something of like the mercy in our body's limitations, that we want to, we want them to not be limited or to not have, places where we bump up against. And yet I think that's where our bodies are saying, will you look and listen? Will you actually understand why that limitation is there? It's not to piss you off. It's not to, set you into rage. It's actually to invite you into understanding a little bit more of where you've had to contract your body actually, instead of expand into a fuller way of living. That's where, there is something about listening in a context where you're held well. Because I think our bodies are also, or maybe it's our minds know that we can't bring some of these stories anywhere. We need containment. We need the presence of someone who is tender and able to hold like what it is that your body's trying to say.
Yes, there's an honoring of the body that dictates these stories, or even our bodily sensations, be shared with people that can hold what we're bringing well, rather than in a way that's dismissive of it or that just tries to fix it. And that's what you did. You listened to this woman's body, in this case, her ears, and you started being curious about, why are your ears always hurting? And it led to gold.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It led to gold, and eventually it led to freedom. And in that sense, our bodies can guide us into healing.
Yeah, most definitely.
So in your quote that I read, there's another phrase that I love where you wrote, you talk about being in communion with our bodies, in communion with our bodies. What does one's life look like when it is being lived in communion with the body rather than against the body?
Oh, I love this. The first place that I go to is Eucharist. I remember having communion all growing up in this very generic way where you get the 2-in-1, right? The wafer and the little juice. And it just was so meaningless to me. And then when I came out to Seattle, there was a small church that I attended, and they served communion to one another. So it was real bread and it was wine. And so we would move towards one another and breaking the bread and sharing the wine. And with this notion that God is always moving towards us, no matter what we're in, the reality is God is always moving towards us. And I think that is such a beautiful glimpse of what it means to be in communion with our body, that we're always moving towards it. And that there is the stance of what does it mean to be in connection and being led by our bodies. And that brings to mind, I think, rituals too. And I think that ritual making for our bodies is so important. And we have plenty of rituals that bring us out of communion with our bodies, right? We know those too well. And we have, a consumer culture that bids us to leave what it means to be in communion with our body.
I want to go back to ritual in a minute. But later in the article, you write that sooner or later our bodies will speak. What do you mean by that? How do our bodies speak?
I mean, I would imagine that your listeners could identify some place in their body that has been hurting in some way, or there's a twitch in your eye, or there is kind of maybe a thickness in your throat. I would imagine that we all carry some, even if it's minor pain in our bodies. And that is one way of it giving you language. I think the other way is when we're in nature, there's something of a ringing that happens. There's something of a of a resonance, and I think that's part of our body saying yes. That is a yes to what's happening, and it's nourishing. I mean, I think those are two ways that our bodies speak.
Yeah. And the first one, what I would categorize the first one is just paying attention to the sensations that I experience as I'm living my day-to-day life, whether that's a sensation in my heart area, my chest, my gut, my throat. When I'm in a difficult situation at work, what are the sensations that I'm feeling in my body and where? And just paying attention to that. Is that what you mean by listening to our bodies?
Yeah, definitely.
And so if my body is speaking and I begin paying attention to the sensations in it, that's a great first step. Now what do I do to move towards communion with my body? What's the next step after I'm aware of, okay, there's this lump in my throat. What do I do with that?
Well, and I think the question then is, what are you doing with it? Like, are you pulling away? Do you want to push it aside? Like, what is your natural or default way of reacting to whatever the sensation is? And then I think there's the conversation. I think there's something to mine with how we've dealt with these sensations. I think there's stories even in that in between, that like split second of right there are stories of how has your pain been dealt with? Why have you needed to move away from it? Or why is there a reaction of disgust? Or what is it when that comes online that you want to like run to the hills? I mean, again, it's such a split second, but there are stories packed in between sensation reaction.
Yes. So let's transition to ritual making. Why does that matter to you? Why is that interesting to you? Why is it essential in your mind to healing and living well?
I was thinking the other day, I'm like, why is this part of my vocation or part of my calling? And I went back to just what I was like as a kid. But when I think about all of us as kids, like we all have these moments where we find this space, whether it's in our yard or whether it's in our room, and this space is set apart. It's like your own little world that you get to kind of enact things. I think all of us actually are ritual makers. I think there's something of like when we look at nature, we see the seasons and it's part of how we orient to where am I? And where was I and where am I going, which is such an essential component to ritual making, is that it helps us kind of have a container that allows us to see, okay, this is where I've been. And so rituals, I think, they help us orient, and they become this like sacred space for us to really take account of our life. So I think they're important because they make us more present. They allow us to be more embodied. And I think because of our world and technology, it's so easy to move around our life. It's so easy to not move through it. It's so easy for everything to be more or less blurred. And I think this is a way of creating a signpost that alerts to you that this is what's happening in my life. Here's a beginning, middle, end.
Rituals slow time down. They invite us to take note and mark what's actually happening in our life. And I think of rituals particularly around grief or loss. And I don't even mean loss of something major like the loss of a child. I mean, I'm talking about what would it look like for me to have a ritual that in some way honors and takes my body through a smaller loss, but a loss nonetheless. That's what you're inviting people to do. Yes?
Yes.
So can you give an example? Give an example of a ritual that you've constructed, and why is it effective in the process of healing?
It makes me think of, I did one a while back for a woman who had an experience with childbirth with her first son that was, I think probably a lot of women could identify with it. It was not how she had planned. It was much longer and laborious than she had wanted. And there was certain little things along the way, like certain ways that nurses or the doctor interacted with her that made her feel pretty uncomfortable and pretty unsafe. And so when I asked her about when she was pregnant again, I asked her, like, how are you with this? And she's like, I just really haven't given it much thought. I'm kind of hunkering down. And I said, do you want anything to kind of help you move through this? And she said, yes. She invited me in, and we began to hear, I began to hear her story around her first birthing experience. And the more that she actually gave language to it, the more the story expanded. And there was just so much more pain there than I think she even realized. I think she kind of knew about it at a distance, but to really move closer to it, she realized there was some bad behavior with staff, as well as she had some family members that she didn't really trust that I think kind of exacerbated the situation. And so as we began to talk about it, she realized that she really was just going to try and kind of close her eyes and get through it with her second childbirth. And so we created a time where she was able to really name her fears. And so there was a process of untying knots, like, and each knot signified the fear that has been like bottled in her. And she would undo it. And then the community of people that were around her, had hands on her and her husband. And there was this like joining in, yes, we release the fear of what it is. And eventually, I think what came out of just this portion of the ritual was a fear of one of her family members being at the birth and her body telling her in that moment, that's not a wise thing. And yet she felt obligated. And so she had to kind of make this decision. How do I honor my body and tell this family member you can't be at my birth? Because that was the one thing that kept coming back. And I think if the ritual hadn't been there, she wouldn't have given herself the opportunity to know. So that's like one way where it's these things that are held within us, but because they feel too big or there's just not the practices, like we haven't been given the practices to allow ourselves to kind of drop down into what it is that is happening within me and what are all the stories attached to that. We just miss out, I think, on a lot of ways of honoring. And thankfully, she had like the most wonderful birth, she said. It was restful and peaceful and restoring. And so I think there's something so lovely about when especially for a woman to heal from that trauma and then to reclaim her body and its capacity to do these wonderful things.
And the ritual enabled her to do that.
Yes.
When you say untying knots, you mean physically untying a knot with a rope. You gave her knots and she untied them, and each one represented a fear that she had bottled up inside. And as she untied the knot, she gave language to the fear.
Yes. And I think the physicality is a really important thing. I think that's what allows us to be opened up even more and then have access to more story, more knowing that's been there. There's a lot of physicality in the ritual making. It's one of the most important ingredients is how do we sign with our bodies, like what's happening.
Another category that I think of when I think of rituals is marking something that's happened in my life that's good, like marking movement, marking growth. Have you ever done a ritual around that, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've done one where there was a woman who was doing a lot of her own therapeutic work and realizing this theme around femininity was coming up and how disowned femininity had been for her. So this birthday was coming up for her and she realized this isn't just any typical birthday. What she said was she knew that she knows her ability to escape, really like pressing into like the beauty that's growing within her. And so she invited me into curating her birthday party. And so we did, for her, what came to her and I was doing a more like a Seder meal where we were able to eat food. And then along the way, there were different signs and symbols and tastes and textures that we used for her to tell her story of what it has meant for her to become more feminine. And I think part of the beauty of ritual making in this sense is that I think we wrestle a lot more with our beauty and our glory than not. And I think for her, she felt like if she was going to put on maybe a dress, for example, if that was like her sign of femininity, or if she was going to do something more with her hair, she said that before the ritual, she would feel like an imposter. She said that the result of the ritual was that she moved into the world not only having witnesses who could attest to the movement and the growth in her life, but then almost like this like cloud of witnesses then as she moved into the world, into her femininity. And so that imposter syndrome just was disarmed. And so that I think that there's something really beautiful about, marking growth, especially because I think we have a hard time really letting it move into the world.
I love your point about we tend to be more uncomfortable about our glory and our beauty than other things, than our flaws, etc. we tend to be reluctant to own, to celebrate, to name, just to let in the parts of us that are really glorious and beautiful. And ritual can be conducted to be an owning of and embracing of my glory, whether that's this woman's femininity or whatever it is. If ritual is a new category, what would your words of kind of invitation be to how I can begin to incorporate ritual into my life? Like, where do I start?
Well, I think you start with like, what are the places in your day that either one kind of blur out. So like whether it's you're just kind of getting through your day, or two that are really meaningful and you want to be able to mark them more. So the first one, like with the blurring, where we tend to know that, okay, this is where I begin to check out. Let's say it's at night, the day is over and you just want to check out, right? And God bless you. I get it. Our lives right now are just so full and complicated. But I wonder, how does ritual interrupt that checking out and bring you back to more of a meaningful way of ending the day? So it can be as simple as just lighting a candle before you go watch Netflix. It can be as simple as, if you like music, playing a few chords. And in that, you're saying to yourself, I am remembering my day. I see the different facets of the day, and I am going to honor them, even in the hard moments, even in the moments where I'm not crazy about how I interacted with my kids or my husband or partner, even in my loneliness, I'm going to remember. And in the lighting of the candle, that's part of the honoring of the day. And this is me right now saying the day is done, and then proceed to go to watch Netflix or whatever. But I think I'd wonder, like in that simple act, then what shifts in you? Because I would imagine there would be less desire even for Netflix. That I think that's when we get caught in, oh, I had that thought earlier in the day that I wanted to actually press into or write about or give it more time. The interruption of maybe old patterns that help us take account of our day. I think it helps give us containment. It helps interrupt old patterns, and it can be done so simply. But I think it's seriously just the act of doing one thing that has some meaning to it.
Heather, thank you for beginning to give us language for ritual and for bodies and for embodiment in ritual. Thank you so much. It's been great to have you on the podcast.
Adam, thanks so much for having me. It was a joy to be here.
Thank you for listening. You can reach Heather Stringer by going to thecounselingcollaborative.com. That's thecounselingcollaborative.com. Remember, if you want to get episodes as soon as they are released, please go to my website and click on Get the App under the podcast heading. It only costs $3 a month, and you will be helping to make the podcast possible. Have a great couple of weeks.